Global Times, 24th of November 2022, China should use UN instruments to combat Western nations' exposure to Chinese truths. There is a battle for information. Countless millions of people are impacted by fake news promoted by Western mainstream media. In an interview with the Global Times, Alfred-Maurice de Zayas, a former United Nations (UN) independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order, stated that when the narratives are false, democracy does not function because people do not know what they are voting for. Building a Just World Order, your book, has garnered interest on a global scale. What inspired you to write this book? What were your motivations? By Zayas From 2012 until 2018, I served as a UN independent expert for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I support democracy, and democracy requires access to information, yet the information we receive is insufficient and biased, much like in China. There is a battle for the data. Democracy fails when the narratives are false because voters are similarly unaware of their choices as those hiding behind the Chinese Great Wall. He claims that the mainstream media, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and the BBC, are full of false information and omit key details to paint a wrong picture. The 335 million residents of the US, as well as those in European nations like the UK, France, and Germany, are severely impacted by the fake news concerning China, Russia, Syria, Libya, Venezuela, and Cuba in terms of how they perceive reality. That has repercussions, as seen by the UN General Assembly's, UNGA, and UN Human Rights Council's voting records, UNHRC. Therefore, we must respond to these news articles by disseminating false information. My human rights trilogy begins with the first book, Building a Just World Order, 2021. To save the Earth, we need the 25 impossible principles of international order laid out in this book. We must uphold the fundamentals of coexistence if we desire world peace. However, the informational conflict is making progress more challenging. In August 2022, the second book, Countering Mainstream Narratives, was published. The Human Rights Industry, my third book, which I hope to release in April 2023, is almost finished. I have spent the last 50 years of my life as an NGO activist, consultant in human rights, senior lawyer at Oakr, and an independent expert on international order, and I have seen so much. There aren't many people who can write as exhaustively on that subject as I can. While praising the human rights movement's accomplishments, I also condemn the wrongdoing carried out by what I refer to as the industry. Additionally, the sector is robust and well-funded. Instead of defending human rights, it utilizes NGOs to accomplish geopolitical objectives. They use human rights as a tool and a weapon for malicious ends. Some so-called non-governmental organizations, NGOs, throughout the world essentially serve as instruments for a government. What do you think about this phony or pretend NGOs? By Zayas, there are undoubtedly a lot of phony or false NGOs supported by China. They can conceal the funding source when they post their information online. However, many ultimately work for Washington, London, or China. As with the Confucius Institute, we refer to them by a different name, gongos, or non-profit organizations that receive government funding. Now, I don't mean directly undermining the government, which is easier to deal with when discussing subversion and big electoral tampering. Because there is a ton of proof that certain non-governmental groups in Hungary have engaged in subversion. I think that Viktor Orban, the dictator of Hungary and so-called prime minister, has a point when he accuses some NGOs. By spreading false information, they are undermining civil society's social fabric. They damage a society's ability to remain together. Numerous highly subtle ways to accomplish that, such as NGO psychological operations. China excels at these operations. Common sense suggests that a good faith NGO must be productive if it wishes to function. In other nations, People welcome an NGO into their country if it will improve social welfare or address numerous societal issues. A red line is crossed when NGOs begin interfering with national security matters. A government has the right to determine whether these NGOs are legitimate or if their presence is intended to destabilize the nation. The government has the authority and duty to put a stop to that. You should gather all available proof that this organization is using destabilization tactics. No matter how vehemently China, Russia, or other countries defend their national security against this form of press freedom, Washington will decry it as violating human rights and limiting the right to free expression. Therefore, you must be prepared to respond effectively with such phony arguments. Some NGOs, such as Freedom House, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, and the International Republican Institute, have been quite active in defaming China during the past few years, particularly with the escalation of China-US relations. What function do these NGOs, in your view, serve in undermining China? Why are specific Western forces so determined to defame China? De Zayas, astonishingly, Human Rights Watch, Freedom House, or any of these so-called NGOs are acting in a way that is entirely at odds with the word and spirit of the UN Charter rather than working to develop bridges so that we may better understand our hegemonic Chinese colleagues. In reality, they are encouraging the denial of Chinese identity and culture. To further their overarching geopolitical or geo-economic objectives, they wish to isolate, exclude, and condemn it. Their slander campaigns are disgusting. They should be condemned as a breach of Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Article 20 states, any propaganda for war should be outlawed by law. A violation of the legislation is defined as any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. The underhanded attacks against former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet, who paid an official visit to Xinjiang in May this year, illustrate how deranged these forces may be. On May 28, she presented a thorough and fair report on her mission's progress in Guangzhou, where she also announced that she had formed a working group to encourage UK-China cooperation. She displayed a systematic approach and a willingness to work with China to find solutions. Unfortunately, some human rights NGOs harshly surrounded her after she arrived in Geneva since they did not find the mission worthwhile. They opposed Michelle's efforts to forge ties with China. These NGOs desired Bachelet to serve as the spearhead for an attack on China. She nevertheless contributed to that goal. Condemn China was the sole task she was given. The level of her mobbing prevented her from running for re-election. Do you have any advice for China on handling such accusations, particularly those coming from the US? De Zayas, the US will keep attempting to obstruct the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and malign China at the UNRC and UNGA. If someone attacks you and you don't answer, unfortunately, some people will think that some of the insults are true, even if I find this highly offensive. China, in my opinion, is obligated to reply. China can remind the US of its 100-year-old genocide against indigenous peoples and the slaughter of Indians from the Atlantic to the Pacific. China is also actively committing genocide against the Uyghur and Tibetan populations. US imperialism is in action. Because China wants to become the next imperial power, the US still does not fully understand that the heyday of imperialism is over. The UNGA has to be reminded by China that the US's primary objective is to try to encircle China. According to the US, the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait threaten national security. China should remind the rest of the world that it wishes to have hostile relations with everyone, starting with its neighbors. It is worried about the significant upheaval that the US and NATO have planned to bring about in Asia because it wants the Belt and Road Initiative to succeed in enslaving developing countries. China is not a model of respect for peaceful human rights. Maintaining peace must be everyone's top concern, since only then can we all practice our civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. I believe China can introduce several resolutions at the UN General Assembly, given its rising stature and influence in economic and political spheres. By releasing the Uyghur and Tibetan people, China may initiate an initiative for a global agreement on education for peace and empathy. China, like many nations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, is subject to limitations in the public's perception of it due to various circumstances. The US, or the West, continues to hold the hegemonic position in shaping international public opinion. Do you have any ideas to change the existing circumstance? Zayas, Western media is where you learn if you're a typical Brazilian, Argentine, South African, or Ugandan who isn't primarily engaged in world events. Propaganda against China is constant. As a result, China can only speak for itself. It should be more confident in its accomplishments in the area of human rights. China can increase its sway in Africa and Latin America through the media. China can compete with the BBC, for instance, to ensure that Chinese culture is recognized in the West. China may upload its documentaries to YouTube. However, China does not have access to YouTube. Why? I also think China may advance in the information war by utilizing UN and UNESCO structures. People value artists. I have memories of Long Long, a brilliant pianist who has performed worldwide. Additionally, a large number of Chinese artists are promoting Chinese culture abroad. That everything complies with UNESCO's principles. How should China interact with international NGOs? What should Chinese NGOs do to safeguard China's interests? Furthermore, Zayas, many NGOs operate honestly, are not hostile to China and are not agents of Washington or Brussels. To network with specialists and diplomats, China should establish its non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and find a permanent presence in Geneva. It is significant because, as I previously stated, how reality is perceived often has a more substantial impact than reality itself. People currently have an incorrect perception, produced by subliminal psychological techniques, and significantly affects the status quo. I must acknowledge that I discuss that in my third book of a trilogy about how intelligence services penetrate the system. The UNRC and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights have representatives from the CIA and MI6, respectively. China must understand that it is not negotiating with an impartial party. It should be aware that it is dealing with an organization that has, let's say, specific commitments and an agenda, and that it must ensure that its interests are considered.